Welcome back to HMP. My name is Adam. And if you're anything like me, you enjoy a bit of Hollywood history, Big names that have become synonymous with Hollywood and entertainment like Elvis, Marilyn Monroe, Clint Eastwood, Danny Thomas, Mark Spitz, Barry Gordy, names we all recognize. But every now and then, if you look really close, there's often another person that you don't recognize in celebrity photos. A name, a face that you might not recognize, but that person means a lot more to Hollywood and its history than one might ever suspect. And today's guest is a child of one of the most interesting men in Hollywood, and he's written a book about his father entitled Driving Marilyn, The Life and Times of Legendary Hollywood Agent Norman Brokaw. Please welcome to the show Norman's youngest son, Joel Brokaw. Joel, thanks so much for stopping by, man.
Well, thank you, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here.
I really enjoyed your book, as we were saying just before we kind of started the show here and everything. I normally do not care for most people that send me books with information and they're like, hey, here's a new biography from a person. I normally do not care because the subject's not always that great. But when I saw that alone was the title of your book, I was like, we got to go here and tell us I want to start a little bit different than what we might normally kind of do on things like this. Tell us a little bit about your first inkling as a child that your dad, the first thing that popped in was dad may be hanging around with people that are a little bit different from everybody else, or was it always just kind of those are the people from work?
Yes, I mean that's a really interesting question because I always knew from a very early age that my dad was someone to reckon with, that he was in a very glamorous business. He was working with very high profile people that I knew from a very early age. But I have to admit to you, it didn't really have very much charm for me. And it was basically because I didn't really find that many happy people in the business. I think actors and performers by nature are fairly insecure people because of the rate of failure and rejection that people in the entertainment business go through. Even if they become household names and they become very successful, there is a little bit of that. Is the telephone ever going to ring again? And so whenever there would be people coming over to the house, and a lot of times it would be to the swimming pool on the weekends, I didn't really like the energy. I felt like they were being really phony with me because they would pat me on the head and say nice things, but I realized it was about as real as a wooden nickel. And so it wasn't one of these things that so many people in our society, they dream about Hollywood and the glamour and they want to be in show business and all that kind of stuff. I kind of had a bad taste in my mouth from just the energy of it. And I'm talking about a 3 or 4 year old kid who develops a bullshit meter.
Yeah.
Because of being surrounded in that. So that's the long-winded answer to your question. But as I grew older and wiser and got to know the world a bit better, I realized that this was a business where you could really have impact and you had access to millions and millions of people through the clients that you worked with. And so I had a little bit of a change of heart later on in life.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one of the biggest kind of, hot topics, so to speak, in Hollywood is nepotism. And a lot of people think oh, he got that job because his family has money, or in Norman's case, they would say oh, your uncle just gave you that job. But much of life, things aren't always black and white and everything. Give us a little bit about kind of family history leading up to Norman just kind of working at the mailroom there at William Morris and how he worked his way up through the ranks.
Sure. Well, it's important to note that my father, from his mother's side of the family, came from a show business family. And they were performers in Tsarist Russia. They were acrobatic dancers and musicians, and they performed on the stage. And they had a very prominent career in Europe. They played in front of a lot of the crowned heads of Europe. And then in 1898, they came over to the United States to perform on the vaudeville stage because those kind of exotic acts were quite the rage, and so they were quite successful. And my grandmother and her brother Johnny Hyde, who was the agent who discovered Marilyn Monroe, they were performers and acrobats in this Russian dance troupe. And they continued on doing that through their childhood. And then as they grew older, the group disbanded. I found out afterwards that there was a trigger to the group disbanding, which was they were performing in San Francisco in 1906 when the earthquake happened in the Orpheum Theater. And my great-grandfather said, I don't want to do this anymore. So he stopped. But basically, so the kids all went on to, some continued to perform and worked as musicians. And my grandmother got married and had 5 children, and was, they had a great life. My grandfather was a very successful real estate developer and an attorney in New York, and they had quite a luxurious lifestyle in the 1920s. And then the stock market crash happened, and they lost everything. And then my father's father died when he was 13 years old, which is a critical time in a young boy's life to lose their father. And then a few months later, his second oldest brother was caught in the beginning of the World War II in the Philippines and was captured and executed in the Death March of Bataan. And his mother had a heart attack. And so, it was this kind of going from riches to rags. And so my father's childhood kind of came to a crashing end because all of his brothers were off in the war, and he had to support his mother. So he needed a job. And his uncle, Johnny Hyde, who was really the first big super agent in Hollywood, he represented everybody who was anyone from the Marx Brothers to Al Jolson to Fanny Brice in the 1930s and 40s, felt sorry and said, I don't like nepotism. I already have some of my kids working for me. I don't want every.
And they're always
other.
the greatest, those kids too, right? They're always the ones that are just the top-notch workers when they're brought in and stuff. So I think a lot of people don't take that kind of stuff into account. That a lot of times it's like, listen, we've got a whole handful of ones over here, and none of them are doing all that well. Why in the world are we going to give it to one more?
Exactly. So he didn't want every cousin and nephew and wanting a job from him. But my father was savvy enough from the very beginning to realize that he had to get away from that as possible. So he worked from the very first day to really show that he deserved to be there. And he had a passion and a love for the business that persisted to his dying breath. But he realized that it was a no-win situation to ride on the coattails of anyone. It's like if you have a failure in your career, then they say, oh, he didn't measure up to his uncle. Or if you're successful, then they discredit you in saying, well, it's because of his uncle that he was successful. So he was smart enough to say, I don't mention this to anybody, even though everyone knew. So.
Yeah, I like that, where it's just like, look, no one really talked about it, but we kind of knew, and we were a little bit nicer to it. But like you said, a lot of this stuff, if you're not at the end of the day producing, and as an agent, you need to, help produce for your clients and everything, then, you're not going to continue to rise to the level that, normal would eventually go to.
So my father had a very infectious energy. And so it's one thing to get your foot in the door, but what are you going to do once you're in that door? And people really liked being around him because my father really invested in relationships. He really wanted to be helpful. And he wasn't doing it in a self-serving kind of way. He really believed in contributing and not doing something just because, well, this is a stepping stone to something bigger, or I'll make more money. He always put all of that personal aspiration aside and said, what could you and I do together to elevate and expand your possibilities?
That was one of the things that I noticed about him an awful lot. Was it wasn't really about him almost at all. It was really kind of just about him kind of furthering the clients and stuff like that. And I think that it comes off to me of like, that's why people ended up kind of trusting him, was that like he wasn't going out and just kind of, waving his flag and everything going, hey, look at me, look at me. He's like, hey, look at my client and look at, and what they have to offer and everything. And it feels like they had a safety in that.
Absolutely. Because having trust is really, at the end of the day, a huge attribute. And so, for example, my father never would ever say anything negative about a client because we all love gossip. And if somebody says, "Oh, Norman Brokaw said that this person is a piece of crap" or something like that, that would spread. And so a prospective client would look at something like that and say, he's bad mouthing everybody, or he said this or that about somebody I like. Why would I want him to represent me? So it kind of made the whole task of writing this book very difficult because, I really couldn't get, the full story from him. And it was only through talking to a lot of the people who worked together with him that I was able to fill in some of those gaps to make the story a little bit fuller.
Yeah. So talk about this. You talk about visiting the William Morris office for like the first time. What was that like as a little kid? Because even as an adult, I get jazzed about like, old buildings with like amazing histories and stuff like that. And you describe it so well. What was that first experience like walking into the agency?
Well, we would go with him. I think he wanted to give my mother a break on Saturdays. So he would take my two older brothers and I in his convertible and drive us from the San Fernando Valley over the hill to his office in Beverly Hills. And we loved it because my father was kind of a really emotionally unavailable person at home. But when he was wearing his business hat, he was completely different. And we understood that from a very early age. And we just really enjoyed coming into that world. There was a little bit of the Mad Men kind of atmosphere coming into that office. Everybody was so well dressed, and they were working on Saturdays, and it was, you just felt like this was an important place. And
it was like kind of the last vestige of that sort of time and everything, because once we kind of get past this little bit of history here and everything, things aren't quite the same anymore. They don't have the kind of, the elegance and the pomp and circumstance and as we kind of normally did back in the day. Like you said, walking in and everybody's wearing suits and stuff and looking really nice and whatnot. And we've replaced that with a much more casual affair with everything. And I imagine that might align as well today as well.
Oh, for sure. And I think that, it was a much kinder world back then. It's far more cruel. And there was a real family atmosphere in his office too, which many of the alumni from William Morris, they lament that the world isn't like that anymore. And it's not to say there weren't squabbles and intrigues and problems like we have in any family, but there was a feeling of protection, and there was genuinely that old school kind of world where you aspired for that gold watch. You wanted to be there for 50 years. And nowadays it seems like everyone is on a very short leash. They say, how is this a stepping stone to my next position? And being an agent was something my father loved. He had no aspiration to do anything else in his life. He loved talent. He loved all the people he represented, and put his heart and soul into it. And he loved the challenge of it. It's like one thing if you're a salesman and you're selling screwdrivers and shoes, if the product kind of is inert. But when you're dealing with selling a human being and selling someone who has a public image, and their flesh and blood, and they're going through their hard days and their crises and so forth. So it's never routine. And he was like an intrapreneur before that term ever existed. He saw the ability to be very creative within a structure. Whereas if he had taken the job of being a Hollywood studio head, I don't think he would have been as stimulated.
Yeah, so we have so Grace Kelly, Natalie Wood, Kim Novak, Marilyn Monroe. Like, if only we all could switch with Norman for just a few seconds in his life and everything to see some of these ladies and everything. He was all around all kinds of beautiful ladies for all of these years who, like I said before, really seemed to trust him. And I would say that, it seemed that mom trusted him an awful lot here as well, right? Were there any friction over this, or was it still just that kind of their clients kind of thing?
Well, I think that my mother's situation was a little bit particular because she had mental illness,
Right.
and so he was having to deal with a lot more serious issues. But he was very, back in the 1950s and 60s, dads were not stay at home in any regard. My father, I don't think he had 6 children, and I don't think he ever changed a diaper in his life.
Oh, yeah.
So he was working, and it was a job that required him to work a lot of evenings and work on weekends. And my brother recalls seeing him up at 3 a.m, sitting in the hallway with his briefcase, working on stuff. So it was a very demanding kind of job. And I think that to be successful as he was, it required some sacrifice. And unfortunately, he didn't have a lot of happiness in his private life until much later on in his life. But that's the way the cookie crumbles.
Yeah.
But back to your question about the women, these women actors who really loved my father, I think it was because not only being exposed to people like Marilyn Monroe early on, but also Loretta Young, he really got a sense of what being an empowered woman was about long before that term ever happened. And so
Yeah, but long before single ladies and stuff, we had to have women actually start to kind of, almost punch a hole through, that the system that's been kind of saying, hey, we're only going to put you in this little kind of box and everything.
Exactly. And so, and he had so much respect for women. And the chapter that I write about Kim Novak, I think really showed that, because my father had recently been assigned to work with her. She was a new client of the office and was just coming into popularity. And she did a film and went off to Europe and fell in love with a very charming Italian businessman. And she didn't want to come back and start the new motion picture for Columbia that was about to start. And my father had the job of being like a bounty hunter to go over there and break up whatever violins and flowers were going on in her life. And but he had a way to talk to her, which she appreciated. And she said, well, I guess I could go back there and take care of this. And so she viewed him as like her big brother. Yeah. And he kind of stepped in and gave her some advice on things when he would see that maybe this isn't so constructive for you right now. So, and she appreciated that. I said, I had the chance to talk to her, and I said, what was it like? I mean, didn't you feel that was intrusive, him knocking on your door in the hotel in Rome and asking you to come back? And she said, no. She said, I just really appreciated it. I really needed it. And so the other part of it was that he worked as a very young agent. He got the chance to work with Loretta Young, who was a major film star in the 1940s, even the late 1930s as well. And she really taught him about how a woman needs to how to move forward in the business and be taken seriously and build a career of longevity. And so he really cut his chops on her and applied a lot of those lessons to so many of the women he worked with, including Donna Summer. He saw that she was falling into the pitfall of feeling victimized as a woman in the business and in her personal relationships. And I tell a story of him getting on a red eye and knocking on her door and giving her a little present that completely transformed her life and put her in charge of her business and her life. And she never, ever forgot that, and was so grateful for it. So it's, he had a simple genius about him that he knew how to get to the core of issues with people and give them a little bite-sized message so that they could say, okay, I think I could do that. And they use that as a catalyst to kind of pull themselves together.
Yeah, sometimes you just need like somebody to kind of help put you on that right North Star to, right the ship and get you in that proper kind of state there and everything. And I mean, whether you're a Hollywood actor or just a regular Joe Schmo, I think we all need that from time to time. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, where I think the book might have some appeal for people is that we're dealing with a lot of, of television shows and personalities that are really kind of all part of our culture and maybe part of our upbringing. But what this story tells is like what went on behind the scenes in order to make that happen. And sometimes it was something completely off the wall that happened. And an idea would come to my father that he would have the confidence and the inspiration to act on, and things happened. I mean, my father played an instrumental role in the mainstreaming of television. He got involved in television when it was really in its infancy and it was considered to be a novelty. And he came up with some ideas that really jump-started it and really created, what really became the most influential communications medium of all.
I love that part of the book because it was just like, hey, we need to figure out what this television thing is. We're not quite sure what it is. Let's throw him in a room with a whole bunch of other stuff. Go figure out television. What? I'm sorry. What's this now? I have to go figure out television's not a thing yet, and I need to figure it out what we're going to show people. What? Okay, sure. I'll go figure out television. Sure. What a wild thought.
Yeah. He said his boss told him, we want you to form the West Coast department of what we think is going to be called television. And he said to his boss, how would you like me to proceed? And his boss said to him, I leave that up to you. And so he came home and he took out a big piece of legal paper and some pencils, and he started to make 2 lists. And on one list was a number of actors and actresses who had a recognizable name, but maybe who weren't so hot any longer, put them on one side of the list. And then he put a whole bunch of B film directors on the other side, people who could churn out these 10-day wonders, these low budget films. And he put those 2 things together, and that became really the start of filmed dramatic and comedy series. Only I Love Lucy was the only one on television at the time when he was starting up on this. And, they certainly created a model that of how you could become successful with television that my father helped to build upon.
And isn't it funny that it's like it's kind of the cyclical thing in a lot of ways, because that method of finding kind of not past their expiration dates, but past their super high priority in Hollywood actors and everything is the same with directors and whatnot that were going on low budget and everything. As much as things change, they often very much stay the same as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the funny thing is that if you've had a success, even if it was 20 years ago or something like that, you're always a threat for things to hit again. And so, I mean, it's a very small club of people who have made the grade. But once you're there, you are considered to be a commodity.
Now, we all remember that scene in Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood where Al Pacino's Martin Scorsese is, kind of courting Leonardo DiCaprio's Rick Dalton. He's saying that he's trying to convince him to go to Italy to star in spaghetti westerns. Now, Norman found himself in a bit of a similar situation, but the scenario was with Clint Eastwood. But unlike Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, it was Clint who actually wanted to go to Italy. But most of the people told him he was crazy. But Norman and the guys at William Morris thought there might be a little bit more something different than that, huh?
Well, I think the way I got the story was that, back in that time period in the early 1960s, if you were on television, if you were an actor on television and you wanted to do a movie, just forget about it. You're not welcome. The gate is not about to open.
Never the twain shall meet. Yeah,
that's right. And so on one end, my father got the first big star to make the jump into the little box, which was Loretta Young. and that opened the floodgates for the film people to see that television was a good thing. But making the jump from the other side was an issue. My father signed Clint Eastwood to the agency. And as I explained in the book, there was a collegial kind of situation in which if you signed a client, it didn't necessarily mean you'd be day-to-day with them. You might assign them to a lower ranking agent to do the day-to-day work. And so my father's involvement with him was more on a supervisory level. He had a gentleman named Lenny Hershand who was his agent for well over 50 years. But what happened was the William Morris office in Rome said, we have an offer for Clint to do a film over here. And keep in mind that at that time, Italian films outside of Fellini and Rossellini didn't have the greatest reputation. They were lots of costume dramas with togas and chariots and lots of low budget stuff. And there was some, basically when an offer like that would come in, they would say, I don't really think so, but they have to tell the client about it. And he said he really wanted to do it. Then the next challenge was, are they going to pay him? Because they also had a reputation of people come over there and then, oh, I'm sorry, the budget is over budget. We can't afford to pay you what we promised. So basically there was the equivalent of a drug deal in the parking lot of the agency with somebody flying over from the production in Italy with a paper bag with cash in it and giving it to one of the William Morris attorneys so that they said, okay, we can let him go on the plane. So he went over there and did the film. And a few months later, these film cans come to the agency and they went into their private screening room and they started rolling this film, and they had no translation. It was all in Italian. Nobody spoke Italian, but they saw what it was, and it was a little film called Fistful of Dollars. And after that, it wasn't a problem anymore for actors to go onto the silver screen, TV actors to go on the silver screen, because Clint Eastwood, broke that barrier.
Yeah. And it's so wild how we would kind of continue to kind of go back and forth with that and have TV stars jump up to movies. And then later on movies, I mean, when I was a kid growing up and stuff, we would have never thought Kiefer Sutherland would star in a television show for much, less like 6 seasons or something like that. That kind of stuff was sort of unheard of and stuff at the time. But it was like things like Eastwood coming out there that really kind of opened the doors both directions. Absolutely.
There was also the thing of big movie stars doing television commercials. Well, we'll go over to Japan and do one for
no one will know.
Suntory whiskey, and nobody will see it in America. But that doesn't seem to be a problem anymore either.
No, everybody's certainly okay with that, it seems. Yeah. So let's get to the title of the book, Driving Marilyn. Tell us how Norman kind of ended up driving Marilyn Monroe around town of all people.
Well, so it's just a short chapter in the book, but it's an important one because my father had just been promoted to being a junior agent from being in the mailroom. And his uncle, again, was Johnny Hyde, who had discovered Marilyn. And Johnny, as I said, he was a mogul, as much of a mogul as an agent could be. He put together the deal to put together Universal Studios. He was a mover and shaker, but he had this blonde starlet, and a lot of his contemporaries in the studios said, this is this year's blonde, and what's so special about her, and we love you, we want to help you, but I don't think so. So towards the end of his life, he was successful in getting her a contract with 20th Century Fox, and as we know, things took off from there. But Johnny had a very serious heart condition, and he wasn't really able to go out and escort Marilyn to various different events and take her to auditions and so forth. So my father was in charge of doing that. And he looked back on that time period with very fond memories. He thought she was really delightful. They had a really good rapport. My father was given a car that he felt was not very stylish, so he, not being the most mechanical person in the world, removed these running boards that they had on the side of the car so that it would look a little slicker when he would take her into the studios. So he was, trying to get her jobs at the SAG minimum, which was $55 a day. And so one evening, he took her to kind of an amateur hour casting call kind of television show called Lights, Camera, and Action. And it was a program where up-and-coming talent could show what they could do, and the casting agents would watch it, and he'd get a nice little piece of film to also help promote her. So she did that, and they went down the street to the Hollywood Brown Derby, which was really the hot spot to be seen. And it didn't take long before they were noticed. And William Frawley, who played Fred Mertz in I Love Lucy, walked over to the table, and he said to them, I'm having dinner with Joe D. He would like to meet the young lady. And so Marilyn Monroe, when Frawley had left, he said, "Who's Joe D?" So my father had to give her a quick lecture about baseball and about Babe Ruth.
Big deal. It's a big deal.
Yeah. So anyway, long story short is they stopped by the table, and Joe DiMaggio called my father to get her phone number, and a year and a half later they were married, and we all know what happened there. But my father developed a lifelong friendship with Joe DiMaggio, and I think part of it was based on some advice that he'd given her when the marriage was really starting to fall apart. And Joe DiMaggio credited my father for helping to keep the marriage alive for a little bit longer, and also preserving that undying love that he had for her. And basically what happened in a nutshell was Joe was really upset at all the notoriety that Marilyn was going to Korea, and the skirt flying up on the grill in New York City and all of that. So my father gave him this piece of advice, and he said, "I don't know of a single woman who could convince you to not go up to bat to get your 57th hit in consecutive games." And he says, "I don't know of a man who could convince an actress to not star in a movie with Clark Gable or Spencer Tracy." And the light bulb went off for Joe DiMaggio with that, and he credited that advice, as I said, to really preserving that love.
I still will always this book is just like this little tiny bit right here that Fred Mertz is the one who introduced the two of them is still absolutely hilarious to me. I was just like, this was the turn I was not prepared for. I'm like, okay,
Fred Mertz is pimping for Joe DiMaggio.
Yeah, exactly. Joe DiMaggio doesn't even want to go up. He's just like, send Fred over there. He'll be fine. I was like, what a wild chain of events. I love it so much. Speaking of things that I didn't quite expect here and everything, I think everybody has like an idea of who Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, was, but that doesn't seem to jive with a lot of people, the cases that people that actually knew him and stuff. Did we just make Tom Parker into a villain, or was some of that heat warranted?
Well, never is anything black and white. There's always gray. But from let me explain it to you this way. I'll use a hockey analogy. So you have a hockey team. Back in the day, you had what's called an enforcer. And the enforcer is someone who is there to stick up for your team, and especially for your star player if he's getting roughed up. You send the enforcer out there to send a message that I would stop doing what you're doing. So that enforcer was beloved on his team, but hated by all the other teams. And that was kind of what Colonel Parker was like. If you had him on your team, you loved him. If you were sitting across the negotiating table from him, maybe less so. Mm-hmm. And so, but everyone, I had the opportunity to speak with Priscilla Presley. I spoke with a gentleman named Irv Schechter, who was Colonel Parker's assistant at the time. And they all just spoke about him in such glowing terms, said that he was a really lovely, caring person and incredibly smart. And so if you were an artist and you wanted to have everything handled in the right way and not have to worry about anything, he was gold.
And so let's talk about this a little bit, because this is one thing that I was like, you hear about some of this stuff, but like just to kind of hear you explain is even better. Tell us a little bit about like the Hillcrest Country Club. This was kind of like old school Hollywood at its finest. I love this chapter.
Yeah, I mean, again, growing up in that atmosphere, I just didn't get it. I always felt like, what is this all about? Why? The food is good, but this is a strange place.
Who are all these people? What's going on here?
Exactly. But again, the part of the discovery in writing this book is I had to like put aside a lot of my childhood prejudices and really understand what it was about. And it's like, you have your office, and there's certain ground rules of what you could do in that office, and how do you foster the relationship? In the office, things go a certain way. But the country club was this place where you could go and have a great meal and laugh and kind of lower your guard a little bit. And so this was a place, again, where a lot of the show business movers and shakers would come there and congregate. And it wasn't like suddenly the rules of competition were not quite the same. You met on a social level, you played golf maybe, or tennis, or whatever that activity was, but it was a real power source. And I always felt like looking at my dad again through this with my child's eye and say, he doesn't have any interests outside of his work. I mean, isn't that kind of deficient? He does. I like to scuba dive and garden and cook and hike and all of these things. And my father didn't have any of that. And I said, he's just like so single-minded about his work. And I felt like he was missing out on something. But then when I started talking to people and they would talk about the club and being there together with him, and they told me how much fun they were having with him. And I realized, I said, I have to really change my attitude about that, because he had everything he wanted in life. He manifested it all. And this country club was the ultimate playground for him.
And I enjoyed the Groucho bits as well, because Groucho's obvious famous lines of "I would never belong to a club that would have me as a member," and how he's just like, "Well, all right, maybe we can kind of skirt some of these."
Yeah, well, keep in mind that the Hillcrest Country Club's origin was the fact that the other country clubs in LA were restricted, and it meant that no Jews, no African Americans, no Mexicans, or whatever could be a member of it. So you keep in mind, and all the studio heads were all Jewish, and so basically they said, well, if they won't have us, we'll just have to create our own club. And so basically, but at the time, I think all the members were all Jewish. They were restrictive in their own way, and they decided that Danny Thomas, who was one of my father's biggest clients in the 1950s and early 60s, he was always there with his family, and they said, let's make him the first non-Jewish member. And Groucho Marx had a great line that Marlo Thomas shared with me, and she said, "I don't mind making him the first Jewish member of the club, but couldn't we pick somebody who looks a little less Jewish?"
That was my favorite line of the book. I was just like, that is the most Groucho thing one could ever say. It's like, listen, I want everybody in here, but come on, just look a little more Gentile, will you?
Yeah. And he was great. I mean, growing up in Beverly Hills, we would see him in the streets all the time, walking with Aaron Fleming, his companion. And you could always go up to him and he'd always have a great line. He'd always have some quip to comment on your long hair or something like that. So it was one of the joys of being part of that world.
And he was with us for quite a lot longer than I think a lot of people suspect. Groucho and stuff like that. He was on for a good decent bit there. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No accident. He was an incredibly talented person.
My gosh, I just one of those guys that when you see him, you're just like, oh, holy smokes! How did you're good at all this stuff there, aren't you? My goodness. Yeah. I really do. I like how open and honest your book is. You don't pull a lot of punches. It seems like it's easy to read, but there are also moments that I got to be honest with you, for lack of a better word, some of your prose is really beautiful in here. And I really, there were moments where I would go back and read a couple lines and be like, damn, that's really profound. There's some really good stuff in here.
Well, thank you.
I want to quote something that's off of your website here. And I think this is very much appropriate here, and I love this a lot. In a writer's life, there's no such thing as wasted experience, good, bad, or indifferent. It's all raw material for the imagination and just waiting for the right moment to meet the page. And that is so true in so many cases and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many great stories of how, like, I mean, you look at a filmmaker like Ingmar Bergman, for example, and some of you watch some of his movies, and especially some of them that are just really gut-wrenching, and you say, how in the hell did he ever, like, there was one particularly horrific incident that deals with a mortuary, and said, how in the hell did he ever come up with that idea? Well, when he was a starving student, he worked in a mortuary. So there was something in that experience that he stored away. And he says, I'm going to use that sometime in the future. So yeah,
there's always something if you never and it may not even be a thing that like wildly connects to anything or has any direct line, from A to B on this. You can go very circuitous ways and stuff like that, but you can never, I think, discount any of the things that happen to you. We are all really just the culmination of all those experiences, good, bad, and indifferent.
Absolutely. And I have a good friend of mine who as a young man, had lunch with James Michener, the prolific writer of these, like Hawaii book and all of that, just, thousands of pages like that he would churn out every year. And he asked him, he says, why are you so prolific? How can you write so many books? And he said, let me tell you the secret. I just write the first sentence and then I take dictation. And a lot of times what happens with all different forms of art, whether it's writing or painting or something, you get yourself in a flow and you never know what you're going to come up with. And so, again, it's a very humbling and wonderful experience to let yourself go into it. And I think there's a book in everyone. And, part of what I'm just delighted, to be able to sit here and talk to you about my dad, because I felt like his story deserved to be told. And I think so many of us, I'm sure in your life, you have family members who have had extraordinary lives. And when they pass on and the people who know them pass on, it is as if they didn't exist. And so, I always encourage people, like, sit down with a tape recorder and ask your grandparents questions, because you know what, they're not going to be here for that much longer, and their stories are going to disappear.
And so, like, as many amazing stories as Norman had and everything, like you said, you weren't exactly privy to a lot of those going on for a myriad of reasons and stuff. How do you think that affected you growing up? And I imagine your experience being informative for you and your children.
Well, I think we had to accept him for who he was, and he wasn't going to go down on the floor and play with us and throw a baseball with us for more than 2 tosses before he had to go off on some phone call. So we kind of accepted that, it was his way or the highway, and you had to go with it and take the good with the bad. But in terms of understanding his work and his approach to life, we would get little drips and drabs of it, but we wouldn't get really the full story. And even doing this book, there were so many times I would get off the phone with somebody and I say, wow, now I really understand how his brain worked, especially the chapter on the Olympic swimmer Mark Spitz was really informative for me of why my father was successful. It wasn't like some amorphous situation. Hey, yeah, he's a big shot, but how he got there, I didn't know. But what happened was he'd been urged to write a book for many years, and it was something that I am confident he would have never done because it would be sacrilegious. He would not want to trade on his clients for his own personal benefit. But towards the end of his life, he said, well, maybe maybe we'll give this a try. And he enlisted me to interview him and get some of these things down on tape. And so some of the stories, like the Marilyn Monroe story, for example, is all coming out of what he told me. But that's maybe only 60 pages of the book, and the rest of it I had to be basically forensic and try to piece together all of these from whoever was left over, who's still remaining with us, who could remember it. And the people who I was able to speak with, they were overjoyed to share their stories about him. But most of the people were in their 90s, and in fact, 2 people have passed away since I wrote the book. So I was a race against time, but it was also a race against time with him, because he had dementia and it was getting worse and worse. And I realized after a certain point that I needed to stop because it was becoming too frustrating for him to remember things. And I could kick myself that I didn't persevere a little bit longer. So.
Yeah, we definitely need to continue to have those types of things and make sure that records of those things are kept and things like that. Just a couple of years ago, it was so sad when Gilbert Gottfried died, because his show, his podcast and everything was one of the few places in the world that would go around, for lack of a better word, to all these old timers and stuff and ask them things about Hollywood history that just like no one was asking them. No one was asking these people anything. They were old. They were too far gone. And so many people like did that show, great stuff. And then they would go. But we have, some legacy now captured of what that was about. And I think that we need to very often, especially when it comes to like things like Hollywood history and stuff, go back and like make sure that we capture some of this information and stuff, because there's already so many things in the world that have just disappeared on the fact that we threw film prints away and all bunch of other stuff. So in my opinion, this is something that just kind of needs to continue as long as it can, and to kind of preserve that history and amber there and everything.
Absolutely, and again, keeping in mind that this is what came out of Hollywood in the golden years, especially when my father was active, had a worldwide influence. You could go into the jungles of New Guinea and people would still be affected by what was coming out of Hollywood. So, and I always feel like, to understand the history a little bit better, to know what went on in the past, maybe gives us a little bit of an advantage to help us deal with the challenges that we're going through right now, and to help us chart the future a little bit better.
Yeah, I think we often too much ignore history and stuff and go like, oh, that's old. That's, a completely different time from us. But even so, you can mine a lot of, good information from people's experiences and stuff in the past. And again, if you're not, learning from history, you're doomed to repeat it.
Exactly. And I mean, for me, it's like, people say about my dad, well, he was the last of a dying breed, or they don't make him like him anymore. And yes, the job descriptions have changed probably 15 times since he hung up his spikes, but the rules of the game are still valid. And I mean, I put a picture of him on the cover as a young man because I wanted a younger person to be able to pick up the book and say, maybe I have something that I can learn from how this guy created something out of nothing and how he pulled himself up from his bootstraps and made a great success out of his life. And it's all old school stuff, but I think it's stuff that is still valid.
Yeah, it's like he had tenacity and heart, and it seemed that he actually cared about people. And in a business that can oftentimes be very cutthroat and money driven, and who gives a crap about you and everything, to have that kind of melding of ideas there and everything was probably a little bit more. It's probably a little more common then. Certainly a lot less common now, I would imagine.
And it all comes down to, in the end of the day, it comes down to how do you keep your integrity?
Yep. So now let me ask you this. So driving Maryland it's replete with just a bunch of stories, but ultimately, what would you like Norman's legacy to be?
Well, I mean, I think his life is kind of a boilerplate of what a caring person should be. I mean, I feel like one of his mottos in life was kindness doesn't cost anything. And talent isn't just someone getting in front of a camera or in front of a microphone. Talent is in the mailroom, the lowest employee, to be open to talent and to be supportive and to be helpful. And that's, my father never, ever forgot the opportunities that he was giving, and he was constantly paying it forward. His drug was helping people, and helping people without expecting anything directly in return for it. And I think that he realized everything he wanted out of life had relationships with his clients that were measured in decades, because he put all of that first. And so I feel like this notion of the relationship, of building strong relationships, trusting relationships in this world, is a rarity. And I hope that in some respect, somebody might be entertained by this book and also say, maybe I can change my attitude about life and not be as into the instant gratification and the instant rewards, but invest in the relationship. Because David Geffen wrote the foreword to this book. And the reason why David Geffen wrote the foreword to it is that when he was a young man in the mailroom, my father saw the talent in him and mentored him in his own way. And they kept their relationship going for decades after. And so, it's, as I said, it's pretty simple, but as I said, it's a message that we seem to have gotten further and further away from.
By the way, I love that you've got a lot of really great pictures and stuff within here as well. Dad was a good-looking guy, wasn't he?
I don't know what happened to me, but he didn't pass it on to me. But,
he is walking around. And by the way, your description of mother looking like your mom looking like Debbie Reynolds and Elizabeth Taylor, I turned the page and son of a bitch, if you weren't dead ass on, I'm like, yeah, I totally see exactly where both of those bits are. I was like, man, oh man, but poor Norman, though. You put him up against, a couple of these guys, whether you're, your DiMaggios or your others, like, oh my God, some of these guys are super handsome and like 2.5 feet taller. That's just not fair.
Well, you know what? He had a funny way about him when if you got him angry or you got him stirred up in any way, he would suddenly go from being 5'4" to being 6 feet 8. Mm-hmm. So. But he was, he just felt like his father was a meticulous dresser and very well groomed. And so my father wanted to emulate his father in that way. And I think that, when you are well dressed, and unfortunately I don't fit the same mode, but you project a caring as well for other people. And I think that nowadays we, walk in and the people going into Walmart in their pajamas are far worse. And so I think he had a dignity about him and, kind of a respect for himself that he then was able to project onto other people. And so again, old school, not the way of the world anymore, but that's who he was.
Bring back suits on airplanes. That's what I always do. Let's just start.
And good food on airplanes.
Oh, well, listen, one step at a time here. What are you trying to do? Bring the whole thing down? A little much. Well, Joel, thank you so much, everybody. The book is called Driving Marilyn. It is available wherever you find finer books. Joel, it has been quite a pleasure. I really enjoyed the book, and I hope people go out and check it out because it is a bit of Hollywood history that I don't think many people have privied themselves to, and I think they would. And again, it's a very positive book for the most part. There's life in there, and we have some struggles and whatnot, but for the most part, it's like this guy got after it and made a hell of a life for himself, and I think that's what, to a degree or another, we all want from ourselves.
Absolutely. Well, Adam, I really appreciate it's been great fun here as well. And thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely, Joel. Thank you so much. And we'll see you guys next time.